Welcome to another episode of Frankly Speaking with Sendra D. Today I have with me Peter Rosenberger, who is the author of Hope for the Caregiver. Please note that this episode is part one of a two-part interview that I did with Peter. Welcome to another wonderful episode of Frankly Speaking with Sendra D. My name is Sendra Dorcé, and I am so pleased to launch today my first virtual interview with Mr. Peter Rosenberger. This has been a wonderful journey of face-to-face interviews. So I've graduated to the world of virtual interviewing like everyone else. So I hope you enjoyed this experiment. And so Mr. Peter Rosenberger has kindly agreed to have a conversation with me today, and let me tell you a little bit about him. Peter Rosenberger is the host of the nationally syndicated radio program Hope for the Caregiver, now in 35th year as a caregiver for his wife Gracie. Peter draws his vast experience to help strengthen fellow caregivers. Peter is the author of several books and has a lengthy list of published commentaries and media appearances in such outlets such as Fox News, USA Today, The Today Show, the BBC, and many more. Peter and Gracie live in Southwest Montana. So I wanted to stop at Fox News because that's pretty much the only outlet that I recognize as media on the list. But of course, I'm kidding. The BBC, I lived in England, so the BBC is close to my heart as well. So Peter, welcome, and thank you for indulging. You're my first long distance guest. Of course, I've been in the Central Florida area now for probably a little bit more permanent, considering we have COVID restrictions that limit our travels. So Peter, I want you to help the audience understand more of who you are and what has your journey been, what has your journey been so far that brought you to this point. I summarized it with a few, sentences, but I would prefer that you tell us yourself who you are.
Well, Sandra, thank you very much for having me on the show, and thank you for doing what you do. My journey as a caregiver started when I was standing at the altar and I said, I do, and I did. My wife was already hurt when I met her. She'd had a car wreck back in 1983 that was pretty extensive. We didn't know. We didn't really understand the nature of everything that had really happened to her, what the long-term implications would be. I didn't meet her until she had recovered enough to come back to college. She had a pretty significant limp and about 20 surgeries at that point. To date, so her surgery count has grown to over 80, another 150 smaller procedures that I can count. It's just too hard to keep up with them. 100 doctors have treated her in 12 different hospitals, 7 different insurance companies. Both of her legs now are amputated, and the costs now have soared past 11 million. It's hard to keep track of all of this. So it's a fairly extensive and traumatic journey that she's had and I've had with her. And along the way, I've learned a few things about life, love, faith, God, the healthcare system in America, politics, all kinds of things you learn along the way when you're immersed in something like this that is all consuming. And that's what I do on my show and my books and speaking, so forth, and my commentaries, is to be able to offer the hard-won experience that I've gleaned along the way, and hopefully to strengthen and encourage fellow caregivers, and also to make some stewardship points in our country as we face tough issues in our country. So thank you so much for having me on. And I've done several things with the BBC. I like the BBC, and I've enjoyed them. I've had the privilege to work with them and a lot of other media outlets around the world, and so it's always, I think it's always refreshing to be able to tell your story in a way that is meaningful with a point, not just to go out there and wallow in the, okay, we've had a sad story, because a lot of journalists stop at the sensationalism of the story, but I think there's life lessons that are worth imparting so that we strengthen each other. And I've had some wonderful experiences to be able to do that in the media and so forth. So I appreciate you being willing to have me on your show today.
I so appreciate it. Well, I'm a rebel. I grew up a very religious home, and so I believe at early age I said I could not wait to be free and to be able to speak my mind because I was told very differently. And so I so appreciate you sharing that part of your life with me and my audience today. I want to share a little bit about my background as well, as to why I was so interested in speaking to you, because early on in my life, I became a caretaker. Some may not see it that way, but I was the third child of my mother, and my two oldest siblings had a pre-existing condition. So early on, my family would tell me my mother actually would tell me, if anything happens to us, your parents, make sure you take care of your siblings. So that was programmed early on. My sister was 3 years older, and my sister was 3 to 4 years, and my brother was 5 years. And they both passed on since. But I remember walking through my sister's funeral and thinking, oh my goodness, that was supposed to be my mission, take care of my sister. So when now she's gone, so what do I do now? What is my life without my sister? Because I never envisioned it. So I can so relate to you about this. So just to give you some context as to why I was so eager to speak with you. And now I'm caring for my mother, who is very vibrant at 85, but she's still, of course, advancing in years. So that said, let's turn it back to you about so how did you meet your wife, Gracie? How did you
We
two
met
come?
at college. She had come back. I transferred into the college where I was recuperating, and she was recuperating from this terrible wreck. And so by the time she came back, I'd already kind of been entrenched. We had a lot of similar friends, and they introduced and set us up, and I was captivated and taken with her from the moment I first met her. I really didn't have any understanding, though, of what it was like to be in a relationship with somebody who hurt all the time and who dealt with severe medical challenges. Uh, Gracie gives off the impression that she's stronger than she is. She's so vibrant, her personality is so large, she's beautiful and talented and all those kinds of things, but her body is really broken. And so it's been a journey of discovery for me on what it's like to be in that kind of relationship. And what do I learn from this, and how do I grow, and there's things I've had to face in myself that were not very pleasant. My own issue, there's nothing like taking care of a woman with severe disabilities for a couple of decades to expose the gunk that's in your own soul. And so
Absolutely.
it happens to us as caregivers. We see ourselves under the glaring light of this relentless set of challenges, and some of the things that we see are not real pretty, but we got
Yeah,
to deal with it, and we got to move on, and we got to get back into the game, and we got to press forward.
absolutely. And so I want to, so you met in college and you married, and so I want to know, at what point in the marriage did you realize this was going to be something? First of all, did you go into denial and try to pretend to have a normal life, when you noticed the health challenges? And at what point did you have to wake up and say, okay, I have to do things differently?
I don't think we went into denial. I think we went just into deeper levels of understanding. We just didn't know. And for me, there was a point early in our marriage where it was she went into a seizure in the hospital after a pretty brutal surgery, tried to save her right leg. Of course, the surgery did not ultimately prove successful, but um, we went through that process multiple times trying to save that leg. And in fact, a lot of the challenges she deals with today are a direct result of trying to save her legs. And that's another life lesson we learned over the years, that some things are not worth trying to hang on to. They're so toxic, or they're so broken, or they're so dysfunctional, but we're afraid. And Grace would be the first to tell you there are worse things than amputation. But in this particular case, this was many, many, many years ago. And I was spending the night with her around the clock, and about into the second or third night. Usually that's when things get pretty bad before they get better after surgery. And she went into a seizure in the middle of the night, and I'd been going on no sleep and anything else, and I had never seen anyone go into a seizure before. And she just got too much pain medication, and that's not an uncommon thing with her. She has they overshoot the mark often with her, because trying to manage her pain is rather challenging. And so she was she went and taken, it was pretty graphic. We're trying to hold her in the bed, several nurses and I are, to keep her from hurting herself, pulling out tubes and everything else. And she's throwing up everywhere, and it's all over me, nurses everywhere. It was pretty rough. And 3 in the morning, after they finally got her, she kind of blacked out, which is what happens after a seizure. And she kind of reboots herself, and she kind of, that's what the body can do. And she actually got better after that. But that was pretty traumatic to watch. And I'm sitting there at 3 in the morning wondering what the heck is going on here. And I grabbed her chart. It was in the nurses thing there. And this is before they had electronic charts. And I was reading through it as a huge stack, and this folder. And I was drinking old coffee, and I still had vomit on me from her, and I hadn't slept. And I'm reading through this, and I was smart enough to understand what was going on. To read it, that it made some sense to me. And by that time, I'd kind of been in it a little bit. And I realized this was much more than just a car wreck. This was a total life devastation.
Absolutely.
Closed the folder, and I noticed it was volume 4 of 4. And that was at one hospital. That was before they transferred everything to electronic. It went to volume 7 of 7 before they went electronic. And now we've got a record scattered in multiple hospitals. I'm the only one that really knows her entire chart. And it was devastating. I was a young man in my 20s, and I was clueless. I was a music major. I didn't know how to deal with all these kinds of things. It took me into a very dark place for a long time. And sometimes I still fight against that, because when you see the devastation and you see your own limited abilities to cope with that, it's very painful. It's very hard. And this is the plight of so many of my fellow caregivers, and they don't know how to deal with it. And it could be something as, Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's is not immediately resolved. I mean, it could stretch on for a very long time for some people. So that causes a lot of despair. Addiction and alcoholism, these are chronic impairments. And people look at the spiraling out of control, and they see down the road and they think, oh dear God, how can I do this? And I didn't have anybody to speak into me with any kind of clarity during those times. And that's what I've committed myself to do, is to be able to speak with a sense of urgency, but compassion and great focus on, okay, what does this mean to a caregiver? I speak fluent caregiver. And most caregivers respond to that pretty quickly when they hear it, because they recognize it's like you grew up in a different culture, in a different world. When you hear somebody speak in your own language, your ear automatically tunes to it. Because when I work over in Ghana and I'm over there for a time in West Africa, then I hear somebody speak with an American accent, particularly a Southern American accent, my ear automatically turns. And that's what my fellow caregivers have done when they hear me speak, because they know I'm speaking in a way that makes sense to them. And I didn't have anybody like that to do that for me. And so I welcome that opportunity, and I see the life lessons in this spiritually, uh, relationship-wise, politically, for our country, all these kinds of things that have percolated as I've gone through these journeys with my wife. And we have fun, and we live large, and we do things in spite of all this challenge that she lives with. But it's always there. It's just a part of your life. And so the relentlessness of it, I think, is in the long-term aspects of this is what can wear you down. A lot, we could stand on our heads for 3 days, 3 months, sometimes even 3 years. But when this thing goes on decades and it doesn't show any signs of relenting, this is where the despair can come in, and the discouragement. And this is where we need each other to pull together and build each other up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think that the commonality in caregivers is that deep sense of empathy that we tend to develop, because we have to really try to wrap our minds around what the other person is going through. Because when I'm feeling exhausted, and I'm exhausted because I probably stayed out too late, and my sister says, I need something, can you help me? When I was growing up, and I'm upset, and I'm thinking, my goodness, I'm exhausted because I went out to do something fun, and she's exhausted because of this condition. And so it developed for me early on, that level of empathy. Like, what must it be like to be that person? And sometimes, it can be harder on the caregiver, because to watch that person go through it. What would you think? What do you think?
Harder may not be the right word. It's different, but it is the trauma for both the caregiver and the loved one needs to be respected.
Yeah,
Because it's trauma, and my trauma needs to be respected just as much as Gracie's.
absolutely.
And we have different need sets of what goes on, and so you learn how to speak to those needs a little bit better and a little bit more intentional. I think that a lot of people are unclear on what to say to a caregiver, and a caregiver is unclear on what to say to themselves and what to ask for. What does help even look like? You
Right,
know, you can drop off a bag of cash to a caregiver, but that's not going to necessarily solve the problem.
right,
Caregivers deal on a heart level of things, and where our hearts are train wrecks,
absolutely.
we're all frenetic, and we've got to settle that down so that we can make good financial decisions, good relationship decisions, good professional decisions, good, whatever, just healthy decisions. But we're not going to do that if our brains are kind of a squirrel cage.
Absolutely. So, so you had children.
We have two sons, and then we have now a third grandchild. So,
Congratulations.
well, thank you.
Congratulations.
I didn't have anything to do with the grandchildren, but I
Well,
just
you
enjoy
had something to do with the parents,
the
so
children.
you led to
I
a great
did
house.
so with their sons.
Congratulations for for growing your family, and what strength that shows and determination. So, how has it affected the children and now grandchildren?
Oh,
Grandchild.
I think it's the grandchildren, not so much yet because they're still young, but the children, our sons were greatly affected by this. You can't experience this level of trauma from your birth on without it affecting you. I think it's given them a deeper sense of people suffering, a deeper
Yep.
sense of understanding the challenges. I think they've had to wrestle with their own issues about it, whether they're angry at God or them, their mom and dad, or for bringing them into this mess, or whatever. And they wrestled with those things, and I think they've developed a heightened sense of caring, um, maybe an over heightened sense of responsibility.
Mm,
And I don't mean that appropriately, but I think sometimes we caregivers can take on more than really what is ours to take on.
absolutely.
And that's something I've been working with. I talk about that in one of my books. It's called Seven Caregiver Landmines. And in that book, one of the landmines is thinking that it's all up to me. Somehow this is all up to me, and it's not. It's not all up to me, and it's not all up to our sons. And I tell people, I look down at your hands. If you don't see nail prints, then this isn't yours to fix. This is way beyond my pay grade, but I am a steward of it, and I am responsible for my wife to the best of my abilities in this. But I don't have to fix it because I don't have the power. I didn't cause it. I can't change it. And so therefore I have a different role. And this is something for caregivers to understand, that we can't necessarily change the things as much as we'd like to. We can't, but we can be good stewards and make healthy decisions in the midst of it. This is something our country is starting to figure out. Well, no, I take it back. We're not starting to figure out, but it's something our country is faced with the process of doing. There are things that are broken in this country, but that doesn't mean, but we can't necessarily fix them. I cannot go back and undo slavery, for example. I
Right.
had nothing to do with it, and I can't undo it. But can I learn from it? Can I adapt? Can I become better by understanding how we got to this point, and working with my fellow Americans to move us down the path of healing?
Right.
I heard Woodson from the Woodson Institute. I don't know if you know who he is or not, but he's just a wonderful, wonderful thinker, and a guy who was very much involved in the civil rights, but he has departed. He's an African American. He departed from the Black community's militant thing on this and went with a different path. And he said, America was born with a birth defect.
Yes. Interesting way to
Uh,
put it. Definitely.
but when you have a child born with a birth defect, you don't destroy the child. Well, the governor of Virginia would recommend that, but you
Right.
don't destroy the child. My brother has a daughter who has cerebral palsy, born from birth this way with severe mental issues. My cousin has a daughter who just the same way with severe developmental disabilities and physical disabilities, they didn't destroy the child. I got a buddy of mine whose son has Down syndrome. He's 40. The son is now 40 years old. You don't destroy the child with a birth defect. You nurture and you provide adaptive equipment if necessary, and adaptive education and things such as that. But you don't destroy the child. And so we got these people in this country now that want to destroy the America. They want to destroy the country because we have a birth defect. And I'm like, no, we don't. But we
No.
can learn from it. I didn't cause this. I can't change it. And burning it all down is not going to fix it.
That's not the answer, but we will get to that. And I want to talk to you more about your personal journey, and we'll get to, there's so much to unpack here. So your children and the trauma, and you lived through that, but you also were working and you were having your career. So what was the depth of, how did the trauma unfold in your, around your career? How did you, what kind of
Well, I don't know that I've had a career. I worked in jobs during the first part of our married life just to be able to have insurance. Jobs that I didn't particularly care for and aspire to, but I had to have health care coverage for her. I had to have something. And how do you plan and have some type of meaningful career when at a moment's notice you're going to be in the hospital? I mean,
Absolutely.
it's hard to do that. And I was very, very disheartened in all of those things. I didn't particularly like it. In fact, I'd go so far as to say I loathed it, but I had to do it. And there came to, and it took me into even darker places, and I made a lot of horrible decisions, moral failures, the whole thing. And when I left all that and started out on my own, and Gracie and I started something much different, and we decided we were going to go a different direction. We recognized that things were just, we had almost fallen apart multiple times. It's amazing that she's alive. It's amazing that we're still married after all these years. But that's a testament to God's provision and a lot of hard work.
Absolutely.
But I feel for so many of my caregivers because I understand that it's very hard to plan and run a business while dealing with a medical nightmare that at any day something can happen and usually does.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to say that I had some kind of wonderful career, but that really didn't take off until I left everything and just let it all kind of collapse around me and then started rebuilding. And I decided I'm going to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people looked at me like I was nuts, and maybe I was. I don't know. Maybe I still am. But it's I came to the conclusion that I cannot work outside of the home. That in order to pay somebody to do what I do, it would cut into whatever kind of salary. I'm going to look at $50,000-$75,000 just to replace the logistics of what I do right off the bat. So how am I going to pay that and then go out and make a meaningful job unless I'm pulling down $200,000-$400,000 a year? I mean, it's just not feasible. And I mean, how many of those kinds of jobs are out there? And with a degree in music, and so I decided I'm going to work from home. I'm going to work around her and work around her medical challenges, and then I'm going to build something of value. And I've tried to make it work. I've tried to be adaptive and flexible and creative. I do a radio show right here, and I'm on a couple hundred stations. I just did my show live earlier this morning. In my podcast here, I do interviews from right here, television,
Really?
radio.
So you can mentor me on how to do this
I
from
just
home.
spoke to a conference yesterday from right here.
You did what?
I spoke to a conference in on the other side of Florida, in North Florida, yesterday from right here. I addressed them from right.
Is this because of the COVID situation, or have you always done that?
I've been working from home since 2003. I've been working out of my home since 2003. Now I would go and speak at conferences. Gracie and I would perform at things. Gracie's a really, 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 really good singer. And she's done a lot of very high profile things. We went to Africa. We launched this whole prosthetic limb outreach. She had a vision in her fellow amputees. with good quality prosthetics. And so we started doing that in West Africa in 2005 through our ministry, Standing with Hope. We have several programs in that. One of them is a prosthetic limb recycling program we do, where we work with inmates at a prison. We used to do it at Tennessee prison. Now it's at an Arizona prison. And we get prosthetic legs and arms donated from around the world, around the country, to us. And it goes to this prison. It goes to the prison, and then inmates at a prison run by a company called Core Civic. They run prisons all around the country, volunteer in a faith-based program to help us disassemble those limbs that come in, and we recycle the parts. And then we'll send all of that over to West Africa, where we work with the Republic of Ghana. We treat patients in Ghana and as far away as Nigeria. And then we buy new materials to make the things that can't be recycled. So the limb that fits into the socket, that socket has to be made, custom made on site for that patient. And you use casting materials and carbon fiber and all those kinds of things go into making that socket. We purchase those things, but we can recycle the foot, the knee, the pylon, the screws, the adapters, all those kinds, the hip joint, all those kinds of things can be recycled, and we do. And so this is since 2005. And then we launched the whole outreach to the caregiver as part of that as well. So our mission is for the wounded and for those who care for them. And the radio show and all that kind of stuff is all part of the outreach of this organization we started called Standing with Hope. Standing with Hope.
Fantastic, and I applaud you. And so I want to ask you, and as I'm speaking to you, and I hope the audience can feel this as well, there's a deep sense of humility that I'm getting from you. Was the catalyst for this sense of humility? Were you always like this, or did you?
Well, I have a lot to be humble about. There's, as Churchill would say, he's a very modest man. Well, he has a lot to be modest about. Life has a way of humbling you. I don't know how humble I am. I just know how committed I am to the mission, because I see the value, because people did it for me. And I would be a poor steward of what was done on my behalf if I didn't extend it to others. And I've seen the grace of God in my own life in ways that it's so over the top powerful. And I would be, again, a poor steward of that grace if I didn't extend it. In Corinthians, Paul says, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our distress, so that we may comfort others with the same comfort we have received. And I think that's the mission for Gracie and me, that we have been comforted in very painful things. But the purpose of it was so that we can extend that same comfort to others, just like we received it. So when I speak to my fellow caregivers on the air or whatever I do, it's always with that in mind, that I understand the plight. I understand the distress. I understand the discomfort. When we put a leg on somebody and say, silver and gold have I none, but such as I have I give, in the name of Jesus, stand up and walk, and they do. It's because Gracie understands what it's like to receive quality prosthetic limbs herself. And so that's just become part of who we are. And so whether we are speaking it or offering it, whatever we want to do, we want to keep that in mind of how many lives have intersected ours. How many prayers have we received? How many times have we been held as we sobbed? How many times has Gracie been picked up when she fell? And we want to extend that same thing to others, and so that they can be equipped and strong to face the challenges that they have.
Thank you so much. I personally didn't know I was a caregiver. I just thought I was a sister who just was being a sister, because I didn't know any different, and when my friends,
a lot of people don't.
Yeah, I didn't know that's what I was, a caregiver, because you have two siblings that are in and out of the hospital. People just see us as having a normal family. My father was very, visible in the community, so we just looked like perfect family. And my siblings were very strong, because they never said, they never asked for any sympathy. As a matter of fact, when they were having sort of a health crisis, they didn't want other people around. And my sister would tell me, do not tell your friends that I'm having this situation. She never wanted to be perceived as someone who was needy. So therefore, she really didn't want to infringe on my life. So it happened, it happened, but because it just were the circumstances, but it wasn't something that she actually set out to do. And I'm so very grateful to both of my siblings for that. So I wanted to ask you, so it sounds to me that, you have a very strong spiritual foundation. What exactly is that? And so I'm also assuming that that's what sustain you through this and help you
Well,
to
it
go.
does. And I don't know many atheists who've been a caregiver in their 35th year. You know, uh, good luck with that. But I don't see that happening. And there's not a lot of atheists in this foxhole that we are. You run out of your own strength pretty quickly when you're a caregiver, and you have to learn to depend on something greater than you. And we caregivers are fairly capable people. We are very good at getting things done, but you can't. It's not sustainable. You cannot sustain this. And I grew up in a church home. My father's a minister, and I grew up in that, and I understood these things here. But how it really completely grasped me didn't come until I had reached the end of my abilities to somehow keep the plate spinning and swirling and everything else, and it just all crashed around me when I saw my own failures and heartache and misery that I had created. It was one thing to deal with the things that in Gracie's life, but it's a whole different thing to deal with my stuff. And that's when you have this encounter with a savior who is eager and willing, but not going to bang the door down. If you notice in scripture, Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. He doesn't kick the door down, and he gives you the invitation to trust him. And I've found that he holds my scared hand with his scarred hand. And I've come to understand what these things mean. Gracie's scars are temporary. One day she'll have a new body. One day
Hmm.
all scars will be gone. But his scars, the ones on his hands from those nail prints, from what he did on the cross, those are permanent. They'll be there for all eternity to remind us of just how much God loved us and the price that had to be paid for our brokenness and our sin and the affront to God that our sin is. And once we understand the gospel, and that's what that is, the gospel, that there's no way we could do it, then it changes everything. It's sometimes we sit there and say, well, if those people over there wouldn't do that, then they would be such as, like, somehow their decisions are worse than mine. And I've come to understand better. I don't get it yet, but I'm getting there, that it's not about they. There is no they. We're all in this together. We are
All of us.
all of us fall short of the glory of God. We all sinned and fall short of the glory. And there is no they, there is us. The only person who can say they is Christ, because Christ can look at us and say, they don't have a prayer unless I go to them. And then he became like us so that he could become one of us, so that we could all be us together with him. That's the whole point.
Powerful.
And the way we twist ourselves into pretzels, somehow thinking that we're better than someone else, or we're smarter or more worthy, it's an affront to the great grace that has been extended to us.
I've heard it referred as some big dream that we're all having about separation, because when we shed all this material world, we'll realize how close we are to one another. We are all one.
We
So
really are. When life is a great equalizer, and when we've gone over to West Africa, and one of the things that stuck home with Gracie was that they saw her, this very um, beautiful white woman from America. America is the place of riches and opportunity. All across the world, that's what we represent. I wish these people that hated America so much in our country would maybe get outside of our country a little bit to see it. But when you go to a place like West Africa, where poverty is on such a um, it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around until you see it, until you touch it, till you feel it, till you smell it, till you taste it. But here comes Gracie into this, and she's a beautiful white American woman, and she wears her legs uncovered, so she has robotic looking legs.
hmm.
It's such a stark lesson for the people there that see her, because they can't process. She's a rich white woman from America. Her life should be perfect, and yet she is broken and flawed and has adaptive equipment. And the amputees that come into the clinic, they look at her and said, "You're just like us." And she says, "Yeah, I'm just like you." And sometimes it takes being courageous enough to show your flaws and to show your scars and to show your brokenness, to let people know that, you know what, we're all the same. We're all the same.
Absolutely all the same. Absolutely all the same. I'm from Haiti originally, and I grew up. My father was very high ranking in the government, so I had a very comfortable life. But it wasn't until I went to India. So Haiti had not struck me as a place that was needy because I was in a cocoon, a bubble. But when I went to India a few years back, a decade ago, and I was just a person walking the streets, visiting, on my own, and I was just looking at the poverty, and it struck me. And I said, "Oh my, how
It's
can this be?"
overpowering, isn't it?
That it's overwhelming. And then I flew back to the US, and then I started seeing the US differently. And I said, how can there be homelessness in the US? How can this exist even? It transformed my perspective. This and I
And
kept saying
perspective
this
is
is
what
not
this is all about. That's why when you and I are having this conversation, it's all about perspective.
absolutely. And I
And
said how
as long as
grateful
you
we
live in a
are.
bubble, you won't have it.
Absolutely. And Peter, I just want to say again, thank you for joining us on this episode of Frankly Speaking with Sendra D. And I hope you're enjoying this as much as we are enjoying this conversation. It's very heartfelt, very deep, very honest, very authentic. And you could tell that both of us have been on a journey of caregiving. Mine started at birth. My mother was told not to have me because my two siblings had this pre-existing condition, and I'm the only one of my mother's three children that's still alive. So it comes from a deep sense of humility that I can share this. Probably this is the closest I've had to talk to someone about the journey from someone who can actually empathize because they've walked this walk. So I wanted to talk to you about your book. So at what point, Peter, did you come to realize I need to share this story because there are millions of people who are going through similar journeys, not the same, but similar journeys. How did you develop the
Well, it
courage?
started actually rather strangely. I was not planning on writing a book about me. I was planning on, I helped Gracie write her book. And Gracie was really taking off. I mean, she was singing in big places with presidents and so forth, and she was doing things. And then her health just plummeted. She was never healthy, but her health really plummeted. And our board of directors came to us and they looked at me and said, "You need to let her rest and let's put you forward because you have a powerful message to your fellow caregivers. I think you understand things about caregiving that very few people do. And we want you to write a book and we'd like for you to do a show." Well, I was like, I didn't really, that wasn't on the horizon for me, but I took their words to heart, and I seriously looked at it. And I started writing, and I'd been writing, articles and so forth, but I never, like that for myself. And I thought, well, what would I say to a caregiver? And then I thought, well, what would I say to myself? And I remember one time I was going through a pretty good bit of distress, and I was talking with a counselor, and the counselor said, "I'd recommend a book for you to read, but you're the guy to write it." I thought very long and hard about that. Okay, if I was going to write a book, what would I say? What do I say? Do I tell people how to take care of their loved one in a hospital, or do I tell them how to give injections, or deal with doctors, or deal with insurance companies, or hospital? What do I say? And I realized that that's not the issue. The issue is not the logistics of caregiving. Nobody needs me to write a book on caregiving. But what they need is for me to speak directly to a caregiver's heart, and
Absolutely.
fear, and to the obligation and to the guilt that caregivers wrestle with. I call it the fog of
Absolutely.
fear, obligation, and guilt. It's a fog that every caregiver finds himself in. And that obligation leads to resentment. So when I started writing this, and this is my book, Hope for the Caregiver, and that's become the foundational book for everything I do. And I'd love to tell people it's a very insightful and brilliantly written book. It's simple. I wrote it to myself. I wrote it to that 22-year-old young man myself when I married a woman with a broken body, and I said, basically, son, here's what's coming down the pike. You need to be prepared for it, and here's what's going to happen when you fail. And so that's kind of the whole concept behind all of it, is speaking directly to that troubled place in the caregiver's heart with clarity and compassion.
Fantastic, phenomenal. What a inspiring journey that you've had. So I want to bring you to a concept that you and I discussed before the show, the concept of stewardship. And how did you come about to embracing that concept? And how does it unfold in your life?
Stewardship is an archaic word that we don't use in our country anymore. We're $25 trillion in debt. Clearly, stewardship is not something that's on the minds of most of our, if any of our political leaders.
Right.
Are we good stewards of this great country, of this great freedom we have? And it was driven home to me as a caregiver that I realized that I could not keep emptying myself into this caregiving role and leave nothing and not care for me in it. But what does caring for me look like? A lot of caregivers don't feel comfortable with that. They feel very guilty if they take care of themselves. But I came to the understanding that healthy caregivers make better caregivers. And it's not about trying to be happy, it's trying to be healthier, not trying to be healthy, living healthier. It's just healthy to live financially irresponsibly. It's not healthy to eat McDonald's every day. It's not healthy to do all those things. It is, and we have to be good stewards of our bodies, of our talents, of our minds, of our wallets, of our jobs, of our careers, of whatever we have in our hands, we have to be good stewards of. Because I don't own this. I go back to the concept I said earlier. This is not something I did, nor is it something I can fix. I don't own this.
Right.
And when it comes to America, our country, I think the concept, the principle still applies. We don't own America. We are stewards of it while we live on this earth. But there are people that are coming after us that are depending on us to get this right. And depending on us to leave this country intact or better than we found it. And I think this concept of stewardship applies. We have kicked the can down the road of fiscal irresponsibility in ways that is just staggering of what we've done. We have kicked the can down the road of dealing with the heartache of racism, not the unfairness of it, but the heartache of it. We can't throw money at something like this. We have to the heart issues of it. And we had a president who could have done that, but chose to abdicate that responsibility because of his own bitterness about it and his wife's bitterness. And that was President Obama.
Of course.
He could have done something so much greater to speak to the heartache and let us as a country learn to mourn these things, to be better stewards of the mourning of it, mourning, and the grieving of it, not just throw money at a problem and create more entitlement mentality, which is what we've done. So now we've got rage and resentment, and America is looking, half of America is looking at the other half saying, what the heck is the matter with you? And what we truly, I think, needs to happen is that we just need to grieve as a nation.
Absolutely.
Like with George Floyd, when he died, we all watched that in horror. Nobody had a side to that other than this is wrong. We wanted to mourn, and I wrote an article about this. We wanted to grieve over this. We wanted to mourn over this, but before we could even try to do that, our cities were burning down, and it's hard to break bread together when the restaurant's in flames. And so how do you come together with people who are willing to burn it all down?
And so those people who are allowing to happen and promoting the idea. And so I want to bring you back a little bit more. We're going to get to the political side, but I want to bring you back to clarify. So is stewardship the same as being a visionary? Would you say those are two of the same?
No, they have intersects, but stewardship is looking what is entrusted to you and caring for it to the best that you can in order to answer to who owns it. Okay, so I'm a steward of my wife. I don't own her. I don't own the problem. She has a heavenly Father that I have to answer to. And that sometimes keeps me awake at night because I see my work. And but I am a steward of this. I don't own it. So therefore, I am entrusted to do the best I can with this, but to use good stewardship mentalities. Is it good stewardship for me to drink a lot of Red Bull? Is that a good steward of my body? Is it good stewardship for me to not exercise or to just be slovenly?
Mm-hmm.
A good steward for me to recklessly spend money, knowing that I need to plan and prepare and be frugal and be thrifty and be conscientious about these things. Once you start getting to the world of stewardship, it guides all of your steps because you have a mission now. I have to be responsible for that which is entrusted to me.
Mm-hmm.
And
So you can
and
talk
I
about the
visionary
emotional.
comes into play of that to your question.
Mm-hmm.
Visionary come into play with that because you have to be thinking down the road. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, it's a sense of responsibility that is cultivated in one's heart.
Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the emotional side of stewardship, because one could say, as you were talking earlier about those people who were elected and had a heart filled with resentment and anger and entitlement, and so that's what we're seeing play out. So that is not being a good steward either. So it's not just spending money or drinking something that is not necessarily the healthiest, but it's also the thoughts that you hold in your mind. And we talked about perspective also, being the victim. That's not a good steward, as far as I can understand what you've been discussing.
Well, I mean, we can be victimized, but being a victim is sometimes a state of mind. We
Right.
can be victimized, but playing the victim is a much different thing.
Okay.
And I go back to, again, this, what have you been entrusted with? For example, in this country, we have the freedom to vote.
Hmm.
Why is there not 100% participation in voting?
Right.
We're not being good stewards of a freedom that was given to us. We have the freedom to go to a place of worship that we wish to go to. Why do we abandon that? Why do we take that for granted? That's not good stewardship.
Right.
And so I have $1 in my hand. I'm going to spend it on something. I better make sure I really, really, really like what I'm going to spend it on because I'm not going to get it back. I want to be a good steward of that dollar.
Good.
And our time. I want to be a good steward of my time.
Hmm.
Am I wasting time by just doing something foolish? Am I spending time just replaying resentments in my brain instead of, you know what, I'm going to think of better things to edify myself with. I'm going to be a
Yeah.
good steward of my thought life. And those are things that we all fail at. I'm guilty of it more than most. But once you understand where the path is, then we get ourselves back on that path and we say, you know what, this is the path to safety. This is the path to healthiness. It is not
Absolutely.
for me to nurse resentments.
Absolutely. Because resentment just take you back to the past. And stewardship in the present moment, it propels you into the future, which is help, which sort of intertwines with vision and legacy and passion and purpose. So I'm understanding it more. So I think I wanted to get that clarity. So hopefully the audience has also gotten a better grasp of what stewardship is, because living in the past is destructive, because it will keep
Well,
you
we can learn from it. We don't have to tear down all the monuments. We can learn
right.
from it. But I think that for me, it's one of those things where a reporter once asked me, Peter, what's the hardest thing you've dealt with as a caregiver? And you've heard the things that we've dealt with. We deal with very, very serious medical challenges. But the answer was a no-brainer. The hands down, the hardest thing I deal with is knowing what is mine and what is not mine. And that's a hard thing because we take on things that are not ours to take on. I'm not responsible for your stuff. I'm
No.
responsible for my stuff. I'm responsible for my thoughts, my words, and my deeds. That's being a,
Absolutely. everybody's journey has value, but you own your journey and you can change it to make it whatever you want it to be. And people will say to me, oh, you're from Haiti, you don't know the history of this country, you've never lived it. And I said, you know, I've had my own slavery because, again, being a caretaker at an early age is a sort of
Well,
a
that's a
trauma
little
of its own.
different. It's slavery, and I probably would diverge with you on that. But nobody knows the only history we know is our own. I don't know the history of this country. I've read about it, but I didn't live it. I just know what I've read about. I know my history and the history of my little family. But so I think that in this particular case, we still need to look at what is mine and what is not mine. Are
Mhm.
my resentments based on somebody else's feelings?
Sure.
My resentments, my own issues. What I look at these people who well, never mind, we'll get into the politics of it, but it's
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. And you
take
know,
on
we're
things that
both
are not
passionate about
ours.
politics. So I
Well,
wanted to
to
ask
take
you.
on things that are not ours,
Mhm.
and that's the problem. When it's not mine to fix, look
Right.
at these. Oh, this is what Trump has been trying to do with bringing our troops back. We've been going over there and fighting in the middle
Absolutely.
over bloody sand. What for? What have
What
we done? What have we accomplished?
what
It's
for? It's only, you know, and that's the other you know, the second part of this. And so I wanted to ask you, um, having heard all of that, and I'm so again thankful that you've been able to take the time to speak with us, the audience and myself. So how do you recharge? And you know, with this journey, how did you come to create a system of replenishment that sustained you through all of this?
Well, there's several things. I go to support groups. Now I do them online, virtually. I went to martial arts. I can't do that right now very well. I'm a second degree black belt, and I
Okay.
learned that was for me. I played the piano, and I'm a pianist, and so I'll sit down at the piano and process that out. I may not do it today, maybe. Get out on a horse and ride a horse and there's you can't I can't punch my clock and go take off 2 weeks. I don't get a day off. I never get a day off. If I'm not working in my business, I'm working as a caregiver. So I never get a day off per se, except one day. My son took me out on a fishing trip. We went on an all-day fishing trip for my birthday in August, and that was the first full day off that I think I've ever had in at least a decade. Um, And so that was because I didn't have my computer. I couldn't do anything. There was no phone signal. We're just out on the river with fishing poles. And that was quite nice. And so I find things, and I tell this to my fellow caregivers, we're not going to have the opportunity to do like some people with you when you have a job that you say, okay, I'm going to take a vacation off next week. Doesn't happen when you're a caregiver, but you can take spurts off. You can take sections off and recharge, but they have to be intentional. You can't just do this willy-nilly. You can't just simply say, well, I'm going to go take an hour off, and then you don't intentionally try to recharge yourself. We will fall asleep. Rest is intentional.
Indeed.
Rest is in, rest is the state of your heart and your mind and your will. Sleep is the state of your body. You're going to fall asleep eventually. But rest is something different, and that's learning to settle yourself down and realize I need to stop right now. I just need to be still. Because if you don't take time for stillness, you're going to have to make time for illness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, it's interesting because what we in the world we're seeing all this autoimmune conditions, you know, evolve, but I do feel it's stress that is causing most of it. And so recharging is so
Stress
essential.
is a brutal thing. It is a brutal thing for a country. It's a brutal thing for a caregiver. It's a brutal thing for anyone. You cannot keep this level of amped up stress like you're doing, like we're seeing it on the news, and you can't do it as a caregiver either. It is unsustainable.
Especially now that people are on lockdown. I was speaking to my my assistant in England, and she says that in England people have been pretty much on lockdown for 6 months, and if you do not reside on the premises, you cannot visit anyone, not even in the yard. So only the occupants of a house are allowed on the premises inside the house and right outside in the yard. Children are not allowed to visit their grandparents. kids are not, I mean, so that level of stress is what I'm trying to bring out because, coming together helps us, diminish the stress as humans, but I can't imagine what it's doing to humans now with the whole world being subject to COVID. But anyway, we can move on. On the topic of COVID, we'll bring it around to the political, which you and I have been anticipating. So I'm hoping that you're enjoying this episode. And my guest, Peter Rosenberger, who is the author, is Hope for the Caregiver. Thank you so much for joining us. So now we will shift things a little more mainstream into the world of politics. So let's take a breath because I'm very passionate about this. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Frankly Speaking with Sendra D. Stay tuned for next week's episode where we talk further with Peter. Click the link below to get in touch with Peter. We have all his contact information below. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Frankly Speaking with Sendra D on Sendor TV. Please subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified when a new episode is uploaded. Also follow us on Instagram and on Facebook, and we definitely appreciate you being part of this community.